There has already been 17 visual gameplay updates made to champions in League of Legends. What I mean by this is champions who've had reworks that include full login screens and full promotional material as if they were released as a new champion with reveal pages, champion spotlights, and all of that. A lot of these reworks have been hit or miss in terms of how they changed from the previous versions of the champions, and usually this ends up with the mains of the old champions either loving the rework or completely hating Riot for the rework, essentially deleting their champions. And today I thought it'd be interesting to rank each visual gameplay update based off how drastically they changed from the previous kit. Obviously, with success in visual gameplay updates, the preservation of the previous kit is only one factor of many. For example, if you were to rank these reworks by balance, maybe Ryze rework would be at the bottom because he is still a bitch to balance and probably actually needs another rework despite being the most reworked champ in League of Legends. But in my opinion, the most important factor to reworking a champion is preserving the previous kit, because that's the reason people fell in love with that champion anyways, and that is what makes them unique. And if you're not going to preserve that, you might as well just make a new champion. Not saying that the champions at the bottom of this list are bad champions by any means, but they could have been made as a brand new champion rather than taking the identity of the old champion and just reworking it into something that wasn't why people fell in love with that champion in the first place. Now, there's one last thing I want to mention before we get started, is that I have only been playing League of Legends since the end of Season 3, and obviously Karma was the first ever major visual gameplay update, and I did not play old Karma at all, so I have no solid opinion on the Karma rework since I didn't get to play the old version, so that's just going to be an honorable mention and is going to be omitted from the overall list. It kind of sucks that this is technically not a complete list, but luckily I did play every champion, old and new version, from Scion onwards. So, without further ado, let's start off this list. So, I broke this list down into 4 tiers. The tiers are the overall definition of what my opinion is on this rework and how good it is in terms of preserving the kit. S tier is where I think the rework was done pretty much perfectly in terms of kit preservation. All the same abilities are there, they might be moved around, they might be combined, but overall, majority of the old abilities are there, and it basically feels like the exact same champion, but just with extra stuff added to make the kit more modern or more fun to play. A tier is where most of the important abilities are there, like the core main abilities of the champions are there, but there might be a few removed abilities here or there. Everybody in this tier has a new mechanic that meshes with the old playstyle, and I feel like they basically reworked this kit to like really refine the important aspects of the old kit while removing the more useless stuff on the kit or the stuff that doesn't really mesh well with the new mechanic. B tier is where they have completely new abilities, but the champion still plays the same way and kind of feels like the same champion. It just feels like the same champion, but a lot more has been added to it, and they don't use any of the previous abilities, so it's kind of the same idea, but it's not the same champion per se. And then C tier is where almost nothing from the previous champion was kept, and it's basically changed to the point where this could have been released as another champion, and nobody would really notice that it was supposed to be a rework for the champion rework that actually came out. It's pretty much the worst tier in terms of kit preservation, and it basically feels like a different champion. So number 1 on the list is going to be Warwick. The reason Warwick is number 1 on the list is because from the old kit to the new kit, only 2 things changed, which are very minor. 1, he can't give attack speed to his allies anymore, and 2, he can't point and click for his ult anymore, which isn't a big deal because the same ult is there, it's just a skill shot now instead of a point and click, which opens up the power budget to make the ability more powerful anyways when you do land it, and then also kind of gives more power budget to make his basic abilities a little more strong and him not be as ult reliant as he was in the previous kit. And the only thing they really did to modernize his kit and give him a new ability in his E is that they merged the important aspects of old W and old E together into one ability pretty much seamlessly. It's actually pretty lucky that they had the circumstance to do that. and this gave them the ability to put a new E onto his kit that actually synergizes really well with the rest of the kit, so that is why Warwick is number 1. Number 2 is Nunu, which is now considered Nunu and Willump. The reason they are not as high as Warwick is because technically they did completely remove Ice Blast and removed a major part of Blood Boil, which was the AP buff, and then also they nerfed a lot of the attack speed and movement speed when they moved his Blood Boil over to his passive. Along with that, they also removed the Well-Fed buff from Q, which kind of made it pretty powerful for farming, which is not on the new kit anymore, although it has been compensated with the passive and the extra healing now on the Q. And they also removed the old passive Visionary, which was, let's be honest, kind of boring, although when they did change it later on to give an extra rank of the ability, it was kind of powerful, and it did make Consume a bit more powerful, and some other abilities a bit more powerful, but overall, everything important in Nunu's old kit stayed the same. Absolute Zero was kept completely, but with an added shield. I was super surprised about this because I thought that ability was kind of a bit wonky in one of Riot's more archaic designs for a champion, but it is a pretty fun ability, and I love how they made the new E synergize with it so well to where you can throw snowballs at them, set up the root, and then ult, so they are basically guaranteed to stay in the ult unless they flash. It's such a powerful ability. The new W is a godsend on Nunu. It keeps the same movement speed that was kept from Well-Fed and Blood Boil combined to give a lot of movement speed to make him a good roamer, but it also gives him the potential to gank properly, which is so nice on Nunu, because on old Nunu, ganking was kind of troll. You just run into lane, slap them with a snowball, slap them with your autos, and it wasn't really anything special. He was pretty much a weak ganker, and honestly, I'm a huge Nunu player. I play him a lot, and ever since his rework, I've been spamming him. But with old Nunu, I would always kind of be a bit cautious picking him in champ select, because I knew his ganks were pretty much weak and useless, and I needed a certain comp that could self-sustain itself in order for me to play Nunu, because Nunu was kind of more of an enhancement to your allies already doing good rather than just being a straight up carry. But now with this new biggest snowball ever ability on a new Nunu, you can actually take the game into your own hands and kind of force wins, which is so great on Nunu. And then everything else was kept. Just everything about this Nunu rework is perfect. It's my personal favorite, but the reason it's number 2 is because, again, it kind of removed a lot more aspects than was removed on Warwick, although I really don't think those removed abilities are anything to cry about, because the new Nunu is just so great. Unless you want to go full AP, maybe old Nunu is a bit better for trolling and going full AP because of the point and click E, but hey, that's kind of more of just a troll and for fun build, and I wasn't really expecting AP Nunu to be in the rework in general, and the fact that it is in the rework is just amazing, and holy shit, I cannot praise the Nunu rework enough. I love it. Okay, next is A tier. Number 1 on this list is Aurelia. Aurelia, her W got changed, her ult got changed, her E is essentially the same, except it's more of a skill shot now, so it's still a stun, but it's changed a lot. And then, of course, the Q is the same, although now the other abilities can apply marks to reset your Q more. It basically, the whole point of old Aurelia was the Q. I felt like every other ability on old Aurelia was just kind of like a stat buff and just there to be there, and it wasn't super important. And the only really fun and important aspect of Aurelia was her Q, so I love how they just took that opportunity to just take the rest of her abilities and just mold it around the Q with the mark system. And just overall, the Aurelia rework is great. Can't say enough good about it. Just a lot has changed ability-wise, but overall kept like the same feeling, and it's still Aurelia, and a lot of important aspects of Aurelia are kept in this kit. Next is Akali. Now, Akali, I was a bit hesitant to put this high on the list, but I honestly feel like the Akali rework did preserve so much important gameplay of the old Akali. To me, the old Akali was kind of like the assassin that you picked when you wanted like a more simple and easy assassin that's kind of like close range. She isn't like Zed or like LeBlanc, where they like pop in and out and in and out and in and out. She still goes in and out, but it's more like kind of staying in the fight and using smoke screen to like avoid stuff while keeping close to your enemy and chasing them down with your dashes. And I feel like that essence of gameplay is still preserved in her new kit, despite a lot of her abilities changing kind of drastically, and that is why she's so high on this list. Next is Evelyn. The reason Evelyn's a bit lower on this list is because they did take out the kind of AD aspect of Evelyn, where she was kind of like a hybrid champion, but oh my god, they just improved absolutely everything from old Evelyn to new Evelyn and kept most of her important abilities. Like Hate Spike is pretty much the same. Her E is very similar. It doesn't have that attack speed anymore, but that's just a product of kind of removing that like hybrid AD scaling that she used to have. Her ultimate doesn't give a shield anymore, but she is much more of an assassin now. Before, she kind of felt like a weird cross between a fighter and an assassin, kind of like how Nocturne feels now, or maybe even how Pantheon feels now, to where she was supposed to be an assassin, she looks like an assassin, but she didn't really have the mobility and the burst damage of most assassins. And they kind of did keep that aspect to her where she isn't super bursty or super flashy compared to other assassins, but now she kind of fits the assassin mold a lot more with the rework, with her new ultimate and just her new charm and the way the abilities work. It's like one big burst, but it still has kind of like that DPS style and virtually the same abilities within the Q and E from before, which is just great. And the only thing you could really say badly about the Evelyn rework, in my opinion, is that she cannot get stealth pre-6, but that was kind of more just of a balance fix rather than like major design change or whatever. Like, she still has that passive, it's just locked until level 6 for balance reasons. Next is Gangplank. Basically kept everything the same except removed his old E, which was just a boring like stat buff, and changed it to the barrels. Now, the reason he isn't higher on the list despite one ability being changed is because the barrels kind of changed his gameplay a lot, and it turned him from kind of like an easy trolly pub stomp champion to a more complex champion, and he's a lot harder to play. And that is kind of the negative aspect that made me put him lower on the list compared to some of these other guys. Don't get me wrong, I love the rework. It was definitely a step in the right direction for Gangplank, but I felt like he was kind of like an easy to medium tier character, and he kind of turned into a hard character, which is a bit disappointing for people who enjoyed the easy aspects of old Gangplank. But overall, the rework is great, and everything they changed about him I love. So next up is Tariq, and if you played a lot of Tariq support, this is probably the best rework Riot has ever done, in your opinion, because for support, this rework has done so much for Tariq. With the linking ability on Bastion, you are now able to do so much more with your stun, especially since it's AoE now, a lot more with your heal, and you actually have a useful ultimate. His old ultimate sucked so much ass, especially if you were playing support. And with this ultimate, you can actually finally do stuff, and he still has the kind of aggressive playstyle with his passive that was in the previous kit. But if you played him top or jungle, which wasn't super common, but hell, he was played top and jungle quite a bit because he was more of that like fighter style support, the original like fighter style support before champions like Leona and Thresh were made. If you did play him in any other role other than support, this rework is going to be a bit of a bummer for you, because now he isn't nearly as viable in those solo roles, especially since he relies on hooking up with another champion to do a lot of stuff. But in any other context, this rework is perfect and would have been S tier if not for that one downside to people who played the previous Tariq. Next is Rise. Now, Rise, I'm talking about his most recent rework, despite him having a lot of reworks. I'm not a personal fan of this rework for a couple reasons, basically because he's been nerfed into the ground due to pro play, and his ultimate isn't really fun to use for me. But everything else about his kit was super cool. I thought it was super smart to add the spell flux mechanic onto him to where it empowers his other abilities, and the little rune system with the Q is kind of funny because like every iteration of Rise, it feels like they just keep progressing and progressing to this cooler and cooler and cooler champion, building upon the previous passive with like the rune system and his shield and the movement speed that wasn't even in the previous version of Rise, but they introduced it in that rework and then expanded upon it and kind of put it into his Q on the newest Rise. And overall, just a great champion, just some unfortunate circumstances with balancing. The ult is kind of a bit meh, and I do think he's probably due for another rework. So probably not the best, but the direction they're going with Rise overall is great in this rework, and I can't wait to see their next step in the next rework. And hopefully one day Rise will have an actual final rework. And below that is Fiora, the last person for A tier. Now the reason she's lowest on A tier is because her ult got completely changed from something that was kind of retarded and required no skill to something that is very skill-based and kind of doesn't really do the same thing, although they both do damage. Her W, basically the same, except expanded upon and more useful. Her Q, a lot more versatile now that you don't have to target a champion for it, you can just use it wherever. Her new passive is kind of interesting, pretty cool to play around with, and then her E is pretty similar to her old kit. So overall, I guess you can tell by the way I'm talking, I don't play a lot of Fiora, especially the old one compared to the new, but I do think it's a cool rework and one of Riot's best, and definitely makes her a more challenging champion. It's kind of similar to Gangplank, where not a lot was changed, but some easier aspects of the champion was changed, which is why any given main would maybe be a bit disappointed, because they actually have to use skill now for the champion, and I feel like the skill bump overall for the game was positive, but for people who enjoyed the previous kits, it might be a bit of a bummer that now they don't have as simple of a champion to play. Now on to B tier. Now these are champions, again, who had all of their abilities basically completely changed from the ground up, but a lot of the same play styles and gameplay aspects of the previous version stayed present in this new kit. So number one on this tier is Scion. Now Scion is a bit of an interesting character, because I felt like he was two characters in one. With old Scion, you had AP, where you maxed Q and W, and you didn't even bother with E and Ultimate. It was the only champion in League where you wouldn't level up your Ultimate at level 6, because with AP Scion, it just was pretty much useless. And you would use your Q and W when there were super powerful abilities just to burst people down and kind of like troll around. Or you could build 80 Scion, focusing on maxing your E and your Ultimate, and then basically ignore the W and the Q. You would use it for their utility purposes, like the shield on the W, the base shield, and the stun on the Q. But besides that, the abilities were kind of useless, because two of his abilities were AP scaling, the other two were 80 scaling, and they didn't really mesh together, and it was a weird kind of kit. And what this rework did was kind of take the more 80 aspects of Scion while still preserving some of the aspects from the AP kit and kind of turning it into a more consistent character. It didn't feel like two kits were cut in half and then slapped together on some weird Frankenstein of a kit. It all kind of works together. The Q still stuns, but it's more of like a charged up and more AD based. His W is basically still the same, but it's a lot more suited towards being ability used for a tankier champion who may also benefit a bit from AD. It still has a bit of AP scaling to preserve that like old aspect of Scion, but honestly, if you don't want to troll on him, you'd basically just still use it to build tank. His E also has a bit of AP scaling, and I've seen some AP Scions pop off with the E and the base damage on the ultimate and the W, but it's not nearly as one or the other as old Scion was. The kit is a lot more consistent and fluid, and I'm pretty sure anyone who's played the new Scion can agree that the kit just works together like any other champion would in League of Legends. So fix that major problem with old Scion, and that's what's great about it. And that's why it's top of the B tier list, because it is the best rework that changed a lot of the abilities from the previous kit, basically completely scrapping them and making them from the ground up, but they kept what made Scion important, and I think it was pretty much the best rework of these types of rework. So next on the list is Warwick, and similar to old Scion, let's be honest, old Warwick was a mess. I played a lot of old Warwick, so I hope I'm not offending a lot of old Warwick mains out there. I was one of you, but let's be honest, old Warwick's kit was stupid. You just slap down QWER, as a bunch of glob of abilities. You didn't even think in your mind that they're all separate abilities. You just use them all because that's what you do on Yorick. Hell, he bought Manamune just because you're spamming abilities so much and you just want to use it whenever it's up. Didn't matter when you use it or in what context, you just slap it down and maybe you'd get fed and pop off and just walk around and be a fucking stupid limping ghoul guy, but other times you just didn't really do anything and the enemy was annoyed anyways because there's just a bunch of ghouls on them that they couldn't really click on. And the new Yorick just gave identity to his kit. I don't know how they could have done a Yorick rework badly just because the base kit was so problematic and there's so much to fix. But with new Yorick, they finally gave him purpose to use his abilities at certain times. Basically, now you have your W, which is a pretty interesting CC ability, kind of an indirect CC ability since it doesn't really stun them or root them. It just kind of traps them in an area like a Jarvan ult. Then you had the Grave system where you have to kind of build up your ghouls and then when they're ready to use, you just slap your E on them and then you're just a lot more powerful as kind of like a Juggernaut character. It's basically that you were a Juggernaut character, but you had these ghouls as your specific window of power, and once you built them up and were ready to throw them out, you could deal out a lot of damage, especially if you ended up trapping the champion inside and then they can't get away from the ghouls. That combined with your ultimate, who did so much damage, and then also using the idea of having a Juggernaut with ghouls as a reason to make him into a split pusher and have the ghouls run it down lane was just such a cool strategic addition to the game. Like, more so than any other rework, I think this rework was the best in like giving his gameplay update a defined strategy to work around, which was split pushing. It really felt like they had a gameplay idea in mind, like a strategic reason to pick Yorick. With a lot of these other reworks, I feel like they're just trying to make the champions better and more fun to play and more healthy and all that. But with Yorick, they actually tried to add a strategic reason to pick him over another champion, which is, I feel, is something they only really do in new champion releases. So it was really cool to see that in a rework, and overall, the Yorick rework, really good. My second personal favorite rework. It was my favorite up until the new rework came out, but I put it below Scion on B tier just because of like how his abilities changed so drastically from the previous kit. But I see that as a good thing just because of old Yorick's kit was kind of a mess, and I played a lot of old Yorick, so don't think that I don't understand how the old champion worked. I understand how the old champion worked a lot. Next is Gallio. Now, Gallio, I have a very similar opinion on as Yorick. I personally hated Gallio's old kit, but I see how there was reason that other people did personally like it, which is why I kind of put it lower than Yorick, because I don't think there was a bunch of unredeemable factors to old Gallio. I'd love to see his old W return in some form, and maybe some other aspects of his kit, but overall, the Gallio rework, initially, I think it was kind of more of a bad rework, because it changed him from a mage with tanky attributes to a full-on tank. People were still playing him mid because of his anti-mage attributes and his semi-global ultimate being super useful in mid lane, which, by the way, I think was such a cool strategic niche, especially the fact that they kept it. But besides that, he was a pure tank when he first released, and that was kind of a bit too much of a deviation from his previous kit, where he was more of a mage with tanky attributes. But then later, in the beginning of 2018, they did that ridiculous update to Gallio that gave him a bunch of AP scalings. Initially, his Q was way too overpowered, and he basically turned into a burst mage assassin with the classification of tank on his champion profile. But then they nerfed the AP damage on the Q, as they should have, and overall, with a bunch of balance tweaks, they've kind of made Gallio into a really fun AP bruiser champion that I think is a super unique and great addition to League of Legends in general, because similar to Yorick, it introduces a strategic niche that isn't really encapsulated by any other champion, being like a mid-lane, anti-mage, kind of more tanky champion, but still acting like as a mage. Kind of like how old Urgot acted as an anti-ADC, rest in peace old Urgot. Speaking of old Urgot, since I'm already on the topic, the next rework is Urgot. As many of you guys know from my previous videos, I was an old Urgot main. He was my most played champion by far, so I'm very familiar with like the changes that happened before the rework to after the rework. And what I can say about it is that the rework is really great. The final result of the current Urgot is super great for the game, and he probably deserves to be in the game more than old Urgot, but they kind of don't feel like the same champion. There was a lot of really important and cool aspects from old Urgot that are more marksman and range based that got removed in the new Urgot to favor more of a juggernaut focused playstyle. Like right now, Urgot kind of feels more like a melee champion with ranged attributes. Obviously he's ranged, but it's only by a little bit, and he does go into melee range and kind of play like a melee character. Whereas before, he was kind of like a ranged champion, but he could go into melee and go toe-to-toe with melee champions. So he is more like ranged with melee aspects, and now he's more melee with ranged aspects, if you know what I mean. But I do go more into depth on talking about Urgot in another video, so there'll be a card up above to check that out, and I'll probably be talking a lot more about Urgot in the future. So if you want to learn more about that, in my opinion on that, you can check that. But for now, let's just move on to the next champion. C tier, number 1, the best one in C tier is Poppy. So Poppy, you're probably surprised she's not at the top if you look objectively at her abilities and are like, well, her Q kind of the same as the old Q. Her W kind of the same as her old passive. Her E, the exact same ability, and her ult, it kind of removes someone from a fight like the old ult did. But the problem is, this was the only rework where I feel like they just completely changed the champion's role, and this pissed me off personally because I was an old Poppy player. Old Poppy needed a rework, let's be honest. I'm not saying she didn't need a rework, but she was kind of played like a Pantheon, like a Xin Zhao, to where she was kind of like an assassin-esque fighter. She was kind of like a diver, where she did a lot of damage and she had some defensive abilities, but she wasn't like super flashy like some other assassins. And I felt really that she was an assassin, but her passive was the way of like avoiding damage rather than dashing out of areas. And I really like that aspect of Poppy. It really meshed with her theme of being like a Yoral who really doesn't give a fuck and is like, I'm small, but I'm gonna kick ass anyways. And I just love that aspect of Poppy, and that was kind of completely removed in the rework. Despite a lot of her abilities being the same and she's still like a very aggressive tank, she's still built full tank. Like, her original Q was basically the best scaling ability in League. It had like 100 plus AD scaling ratio, about a 100% AP scaling ratio. It could critically strike, it converted everything into magic damage. It was basically the best auto attack reset in the game, and then you could play around that with the free stats from her W, where it gave her free armor and free movement speed, and then obviously the survivability aspects of the passive and the ultimate really made her a champion where you wanted to build full damage, go in, and then try to survive with these defensive abilities inherently in her kit. And that was pretty much completely removed in the rework in favor of making her more of an aggressive, tanky champion, which isn't necessarily a bad thing. I don't think the end product of Poppy is a bad champion, but I think it was the first instance of a rework where it really alienated a lot of mains. I know a lot of old Poppy players who just stopped playing the game completely after Poppy's rework, and I feel like this was the first major instance of that happening to any rework, and it kind of set a bad trend for some future reworks, which are 2 that I'm gonna be talking about below Poppy. But yeah, just overall kind of disappointed in the change of direction for her playstyle. Second to last champion rework is Swain. Old Swain, he was a DPS dot champion. There were some enjoyable aspects of him. I didn't personally enjoy him that much, but I could see why someone did. And new Swain has a lot of those same aspects in his ultimate, which I'm super glad for. I think his new ult is actually really cool and a direct improvement from his previous ultimate. But all of his basic abilities were pretty much changed extremely drastically. I mean, the E kept the kind of the same name from the old W, but besides rooting, it didn't really have the same type of function. His shotgun gameplay is really cool with the Q. His W ability is really cool. I love everything about new Swain, but it just isn't the old Swain. There's no damage over time, which I guess some people see as a balance issue. There's damage over time on other champions, and maybe having a champion completely reliant on damage over time isn't super healthy, but they didn't really keep any of those aspects in Swain besides in the ultimate, and just overall disappointed in how much they removed from the old champion. Even visually, like, they removed Beatrice and a lot of the bird aspects of the champion. I heard in like a development post or something like that, that they were considering not even having the birds at all in this kit, and then they kind of re-added it back into the kit once they kind of realized that this is kind of a core aspect of Swain and people are gonna miss this. And overall, it's just like kind of disappointed with how much he changed. I love the final result of the rework, but it really felt like it could have been a new champion. Besides the ultimate, I feel like the ultimate is a direct improvement. Again, I said this for Poppy, I'm not saying Swain didn't need a rework, Swain definitely did need a rework, but I feel like this is just too much change. And the final champion on the list, you can probably guess by now, Aatrox. So there's something special I do with champions that are about to get reworked. A couple days before the patch comes out where the rework is going to be implemented, I spam that old version of the champion so much so I get sick of it, and then I won't miss that old version of the champ when the new rework comes out. For champions like Gallio and Warwick, this worked really well for me to never miss the old version of the champion. But for Aatrox, this actually kind of backfired on me because I played quite a bit of Aatrox about 6 months prior to the rework. When the rework was about to be announced, I was really excited for it to come out because I thought it would like refine the bad parts of Aatrox's kit and kind of make him a cool updated champion, because I actually really liked Aatrox's gameplay, but there was a lot of feast and famine factors to it, and I always felt like it was really hard to get ahead, but when you did get ahead, you kind of were a little too OP, and then when you were behind, you were basically a useless pile of shit. So I was hoping that those inconsistencies could be fixed within the rework and it could just be more of an updated version of an already existing kit. And the way they were talking about it with the roadmap and all that, it really seemed like this would kind of be more of a gameplay update similar to Zinzao or Rek'Sai or Kindred. And then around a month before the rework got revealed, we realized that it was going to be a full visual gameplay update, and then when it got revealed, the gameplay changed completely, and unfortunately, as I was saying earlier, I liked the old Aatrox too much to actually get sick of its gameplay before the new rework came out, which kind of makes me particularly salty about this rework. This is not to say that the end result of the Aatrox rework is bad. I actually really like the Aatrox rework. It's kind of hard for me to compare the two because they honestly feel like completely different champions. None of their abilities are really the same. The only thing that stays consistent is the revive and the steroid on the ult, but the steroid doesn't even buff the same things from each version. One buffed attack range and attack speed, the other buffs movement speed and AD, and the only consistent thing is the revive. You could say the healing is consistent from the old kit, but honestly, the healing feels more like Rost. It's so weird. The new Aatrox feels more like Rost or Riven than old Aatrox ever felt, which is actually kind of strange because I felt like they would have wanted to differentiate Aatrox more from Rost, and instead they kind of made him even more similar to Rost in terms of gameplay and visuals. I thought they'd kind of want to make the characters a bit more different, since I thought Rost and Aatrox, even before the rework, already looked too similar despite being the same species. And then they didn't even differentiate Aatrox any further. They just made him look more like Rost, and this is basically just top lane Rost. I own all Aatrox skins, but I can't use any skins on Aatrox with the new Aatrox because it just feels so weird to use an Aatrox skin that I used so much on this old gameplay and just put it onto a new kit. God, just such an unnecessary... Like, Aatrox needed to get reworked, just like everybody else on this list, but they straight up removed him. I really don't want Riot to do another rework like this ever again. I just think it's so bad to have the mindset of like, this champion has no redeeming qualities, let's just completely scrap him and make him from scratch with the same name and theme and people will love him. Because one thing that Riot talked about with surveys is that people wanted Aatrox to be reworked the most because they loved his theme, but they didn't like his gameplay at all. And that's kind of what they did. They made a rework for those people who liked his visuals but didn't like his gameplay at all. And I don't think it was the case that they didn't like his gameplay at all. I think it's just that the kit did have a shit ton of flaws, and people stopped playing him because he felt weak and he felt kind of feast or famine, and that wasn't a playstyle that they liked. And maybe the Aatrox rework did fix that aspect of people not liking Aatrox, but you should have done that before Aatrox was released, period. This is something you do when you're figuring out their gameplay before the release, like when you're playtesting it, when you're trying to like design the kit for initial champion release. This is the type of shit you do. You don't take an existing champion and change them so drastically that they are a completely new kit, because it's going to completely isolate and piss off anyone who even remotely liked old Aatrox. Even if you played old Aatrox like a bit, like super occasionally, like you were mastery level 4 on it or mastery level 3 on it or something, and you enjoyed him but you didn't like play him a lot. Maybe you're like 20th played champion. It's still a gameplay experience that's completely removed and you don't have any aspects to, and I feel like it's just such a sad situation, especially for people who mained Aatrox. I feel for those guys. But overall, that's my list. What do you think about it? Do you agree with it or not? I'm super curious to see your thoughts in the comments. I might try to elaborate on my thoughts more. I kind of wanted to make this video short, but I ended up rambling a lot. That's what happens with me in general. But hey, if you have any specific question of something I didn't tackle in this video, I'll be more than happy to give you a paragraph or more in terms of replies. Like, I can go in depth about these for days. It's my favorite topic in League, and League's my favorite game. Thank you guys so much for watching, and I'll see you in another video. Bye. Also, just to answer this real quick before I get questions about it, Ezreal is not on the list because he is a more minor rework. He's more akin to like a Tristana rework or a Zillion rework or a Shen rework. And if I started adding champions like that, you could argue like, why aren't I adding Zac? Why aren't I adding Sejuani? Why aren't I adding LeBlanc to the rework list? And at that point it just gets too long, so that's why Ezreal isn't on the list. But if Ezreal was on the list, he would be S tier. Okay, bye.